Today it's a bit of a different video. Recently Rafael from CRK Fishing was here, and after people asked several times if he could do a podcast with me, I finally said, alright, I really have far too much work at the moment, but let's just do it. So about 1.5 weeks ago he was here, and yesterday the video was released. It's over an hour long, and honestly, I was really impressed by the editing, the cuts and the entire production. And of course, through Solitip I now also have an audience in English-speaking and Spanish-speaking countries that I want to reach as well. I'm genuinely enthusiastic about this podcast channel. We already watched several of the podcasts, and I really want to give huge credit to Rafael and the whole CRK Fishing team. So definitely go and check out the original video as well. With Rafael's permission, I decided to translate this podcast into English and Spanish so that people in English-speaking and Spanish-speaking countries can also enjoy this really outstanding conversation. I'm dividing everything into smaller sections. We'll begin with the first 15 minutes and then continue step by step through the entire 1-hour podcast. So I'd say, enjoy watching. Friends, so, welcome.
Also wir schneiden einfach nichts raus, ne? Das mit dem fetten Bauch, also lassen wir drinnen.
We're not cutting anything out, alright? We're leaving the big belly in there too.
Theo, servus la.
First of all, hello to everyone and especially hello together. Hi Theo. Theo, hi. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting us come visit you. I really know how busy you are, and still you made time for us. Thank you. Yeah, sorry it didn't work out last week, but easy. I already told you beforehand. Easy. We're really happy it worked out now. Thank you very much. Perfect. My pleasure, Klausy baby. Yeah, great that we're allowed to be here. I'm actually just getting to know you now, right? Exactly. I had never seen you before today. Me neither. Yeah. Okay, one thing we already have in common, musicians. Yeah, exactly. Right. Since we're already starting like this, I'll quickly explain how we actually got to know each other. I'll keep it short. I was once at one of our youth meetings and Rudy was always there. All Rudy. And we chatted a little and somehow he came up with your name. He said, "You don't know Theo." I said, "No." He said, "Alright, I'll connect you too." Then we talked on the phone, I visited you, and I was simply blown away by your Solitips. That's why we stayed in touch. You already built several rods for me. Thank you again for that. And now we're sitting here trying to ask you a few questions. So I'd say we simply start with this. Theo, my friend, could you tell us a few words about yourself? Just generally, how old are you? Who are you? What do you have to do with fly fishing? Yeah, I'll simply start with how I got into fly fishing at all, because that question stayed in my head. It was actually a really exciting story. I started with casting sport at the age of 7. Right here in these rooms my father built rods. Back then I was already watching, wrapping my first guides for a little pocket money and so on. And that's how I got into casting sport. My father later became national coach. Casting sport means target casting and distance casting with special equipment, with fly rods, two-handed rods, salmon rods, basically everything. It's an international sport, and over time I made it all the way to the top. In 1981 I became 5-time European champion, and in 1982 and 1984 I became world champion, and back then I improved the world record in the fly distance discipline, by the way, with the very first Solitips. Incredible rods back then, built for casting sport. Basically the Formula One of it all. How old were you when you became world champion in 1984? I was 20. Oh, nice. Incredible, that was 45 years ago. I won't tell my age now, though.
Sagen, da war ich 3 Jahre alt.
No, all good. We can calculate it ourselves. I have to say, I was 3 years old back then. And through that whole path, there were these lines back then from 3M Scientific Anglers, especially for casting sport. They actually produced them specifically for that. And one day, because my neighbor was also a fly fisherman, he asked me, can you also get fly lines? Back then, Balzer had the distribution rights.
Gar nicht mit der Fliege gefischt, du hast nur gecastet.
Nur gecastet.
Jawohl.
So until then you hadn't fly fished at all? You only did casting? Only casting. That was after the World Championships in Toronto in 1984. Then I asked Bruce, how does it look? Could I get the fly lines? No, he said. Bruce Richards, the development engineer at Scientific Anglers in Midland back then. And he said, well, Balzer already has WF5, WF6, DT5, DT6. There were already around 300 line types back then, and I thought, okay, if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Then one day I opened my mailbox and suddenly the Scientific Anglers price list was inside. I immediately grabbed the phone and called Bruce, what's going on? Why am I getting prices now? And he said, I completely forgot to tell you, the contract with Balzer is over. Then I said, okay, then I can get into this. And back then I went to the fly fishing fair.
Ah ja.
The Fly Fisherman, the magazine. Yes, that was the first time I went to the fair in Memmingen and presented the Scientific Anglers program. I printed the English catalogue, and the great thing was I could order on Fridays and the goods arrived on Monday. That meant I had a range of 300 fly lines and everybody could order whatever they wanted. Basically over one weekend. Exactly. Back then there wasn't even a fax machine yet. So I ordered by phone. They called me back and I placed my orders. Usually around 100 to 150 lines per week. I shipped them Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and on Friday I ordered again. Then Monday delivery started again. It was a cool thing. But eventually I thought, this doesn't make sense if I don't actually fly fish myself. And then I said, okay, then I'll start fly fishing. Then I got my first fly rods in my hands for fishing, and compared to a casting rod it was a massive difference. What was the biggest difference? They were real, as we say in Franconian, floppy noodles. Really soft. And I thought, oh my God, what is this? I mean, I can cast with anything, but when you've once been world champion in distance casting, you can basically cast everything. That's still difficult today when I test cast a rod. I can even handle setups that aren't perfectly matched. But that doesn't really help a beginner. Because if the setup doesn't fit, people simply give up. And that's how I got into fly fishing back then, through the job at Scientific Anglers, yeah. And one of the things I started doing relatively quickly was developing my own fly line tapers. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And I spent countless hours sitting together with Bruce. I flew over there several times and we experimented, searched and developed ideas together. We really had a very close collaboration. Yeah. Where was the factory? In Midland, Michigan. In Michigan. So you actually flew over to the States. Yeah, cool. Yeah, man. And that's where I learned a tremendous amount about fly lines. Really learned it myself. Back then, all those taper concepts didn't mean anything to me at first. But through all the conversations and diving deep into it together with Bruce, it was absolutely incredible. And then I realized there are the typical WF lines, the short belly lines, the long belly lines. Back then the long belly lines came onto the market, those really long heads with 12 or 15 meters in length. They were basically a true hybrid between WF and DT, exactly. But most rods back then simply couldn't handle them because they were too slow or not progressive enough to properly keep such a long head stable in the air. And after I got more deeply involved in the subject and Bruce explained to me, look, pay attention to the front taper up there, that was also when the triangle taper appeared, the one that never fully straightened out. And I asked, why actually? You build them yourselves. And then he said, very simple. The thinner the diameter becomes, the more energy the line loses. Yeah. And of course your mind immediately starts working.
Yeah.
If the line loses energy and I'm fishing for pike, for example, and my streamer always lands behind the end of the fly line and collapses instead of turning over cleanly, then logically I should be able to build up more energy by making the front of the line thicker. So instead of a very fine tip section, simply more mass in the front. And then we actually produced prototypes like that. And suddenly you could cast those big bushy streamers with a 5-weight line. I'm talking here about real opportunistic pike fishing. Back then, if you suddenly spotted a pike while trout fishing, you didn't run back to the car to grab dedicated pike gear. You simply tied on a streamer quickly or changed the reel and kept fishing. Now, of course, if I specifically go pike fishing today, I use completely different equipment than a 5-weight. That's obvious. But back then, pike streamers were made from very different materials than today. Nowadays one false cast is enough and those things are dry again. Back then, after the 5th cast they were still soaking wet and heavy. And if the line loses energy at the front, then the streamer lands behind the line instead of where it's actually supposed to go. And that's when I discovered something. I'll get back to the main topic now because drifting off like this is kind of my disease. I told myself, if this works in the front, then logically it also has to work in the rear section of the line. You know those typical pendulum movements of WF lines when the head is outside and the line no longer flies really cleanly. Everybody knows it, but back then nobody really understood why it happened. I already knew it in the 1990s because the energy was simply supposed to transfer far too quickly from the thin section into the thick belly section. And that just doesn't work cleanly. So I said to Bruce, let's try something now. We build a head that's 12 meters long and then gradually transitions over 6 meters into the running line. Exactly. Because that gives you a huge advantage. The more line you shoot out per meter, the less additional weight gets added. And the part that is already outside builds energy, transfers it into the main head section, and at the front it gets cleanly dissipated again through the tip. And then we built it. And at some point Bruce said, you know, this thing is brilliant. We're going to make it like this. But he also said, you only get it in line classes 4, 5 and 6. We're keeping the 7, 8 and 9 weights and we'll call them steelhead taper. Yeah, exactly. So back then I had my own exclusive fly line from them, but only in the lighter line classes. And now today it's happening again. Besides rod building, people constantly ask me about fly lines. And now the first prototypes are actually coming back again. So you want to produce your own fly lines again? Yeah. The taper had already proven itself back then. I sold hundreds of them. The line was called Specialist. Exactly. And later Guideline adopted this principle. Not directly the name, but the whole taper concept itself. Back then they also added something called Telecast. That was a slight thickening on the running line so you could physically feel in your hand when the entire head was outside. Back then it was called Telecast. And honestly, it was a really smart idea. Especially while shooting line it was brilliant. It wasn't a color change or anything visible. You simply felt it. And still there was barely any resistance in the guides. The line ran cleanly through because it was only a very slight thickening. They really came up with something clever there. By the way, I was one of the first people to introduce Guideline to the German market directly after Scientific Anglers. And at some point I said, all right, enough of this. Now I'm going to create my own magazine.
Ich mache jetzt ein Magazin, also das heißt Mit der Fliege, die Zeitschrift. Die kam 1997 raus.
Hast du deine eigene Zeitschrift rausgebracht?
Ja. Kennst du die gar nicht?
Nein.
Ich werde dir mal...
Können wir auch einblenden?
Back then it was called MIT Der Fliege. The magazine was launched in 1997.
Oder wenn du was
You
digital
published
hast,
your
dann
own
blenden wir auch
magazine.
eine davon.
Das kannst du
Yeah.
beim Schneiden dann.
Ja,
You've never heard of it. No.
Ich
You absolutely have to show some footage of that.
Ja, perfekt.
Do you still have anything online or digitally? Yeah, at some point I uploaded parts of it again. You can gladly insert that during editing. Yeah, perfect. And the magazine was aimed both at real beginners and at professionals. And in the year 2000 I also organized the first German fly tying championships. Back then they were called Fly Tying Open 2000. And on the jury panel were Dr. Zelinka, Pauli Lupui, Steinsdorfer and George Guther. Sadly, 3 of them are no longer alive today. But that was exactly the circle I moved in back then and also fished together with. That's absolutely incredible. So, that's it for the first part. In the upcoming parts, many other topics will come up as well. I don't want to reveal too much yet, so stay tuned. I'll need a little bit of time to complete all the translations, but all parts are definitely coming. And honestly, I'm already looking forward to the next part myself.